The world we live in is not always what it appears to be. Reality is often the complete opposite of what we see on the surface. Things that seem straightforward are usually hiding deeper, more complex truths beneath. Let me paint a picture for you. Imagine this. America currently stands as the world's largest oil producer, pumping out more crude oil than any other country on the planet, surpassing even Saudi Arabia and Russia. Yet despite all that production right on its own soil, the United States still has to import massive amounts of foreign oil just to keep its refineries running and its cars on the road. It's almost absurd when you think about it, like a hard-working farmer who grows endless fields of golden wheat on his own vast land, but still has to go begging his neighbors for a simple loaf of bread. How does something like this even happen in the modern world? And while we're on the topic of hidden imbalances, consider this every single year. Millions upon millions of shipping containers depart from Chinese ports, loaded to the brim, heading straight toward America and other Western markets. But here's the shocking part. Why do so many of those containers never make the return journey? Why do they end up abandoned, rusting away as scrap metal in American junkyards instead of going back home? And right in the middle of these global trade mysteries and economic paradoxes, another question emerges that sounds almost unbelievable. How exactly does a heavily sanctioned country like Iran manage to secretly smuggle entire Boeing 777 passenger aircraft into its fleet right under the world's nose? Ladies and gentlemen, pause for a second and think about this astonishing fact. Right now, at this very moment as you listen, nearly 300,000 ships of all kinds are actively sailing across the vast oceans of our planet. We're talking massive oil tankers carrying black gold, specialized LPG and long carriers hauling gas, powerful tugboats guiding the giants, luxurious cruise liners full of vacationers, and, most critically for the global economy, the countless container ships that form the backbone of international trade. Experts estimate that around 90% of all global trade by volume moves across these sea routes. At any given minute of the day or night, between 6,000 and 8,000 massive container ships are out there crossing the oceans, relentlessly keeping the wheels of commerce turning. Thanks to modern technology like the Automatic Identification System, better known as AIS, we can now track almost every one of these vessels in real time. If you ever visit popular tracking websites such as Marine Traffic or Vessel Finder, the entire world's oceans suddenly light up like a glittering Christmas tree on your screen. Each one of those tiny blinking dots represents a colossal ship loaded with cargo worth tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars. The majority of these vessels originate from bustling ports in China before setting course for major destinations in Europe and North America. On average, a single large container ship today carries about 5,000 standard 20-foot containers, or the equivalent in larger 40-foot units. When you do the math, that means roughly 40 million containers are floating somewhere on the seas at any given time, carrying goods from one corner of the globe to another. Think about your everyday life for a moment. The clothes you're wearing right now, the smartphone in your pocket, the electronics on your desk, even the furniture in your home. Almost every single item you use once traveled thousands of miles inside one of these plain metal boxes. On the surface, the system appears perfectly balanced and efficient. Containers arrive at their destination ports full of goods, get unloaded, and then the empty ones are shipped back to be refilled and reused. Simple, right? But the harsh truth is far more shocking and revealing than that polished surface suggests. Global trade today is wildly, almost dangerously imbalanced. China has become such an overwhelmingly dominant exporter that entire fleets of fully loaded containers depart its ports every single day, heading out to satisfy the world's insatiable demand. Just look at the numbers from 2023 alone. China recorded a staggering trade surplus of more than $823 billion. That year, the country exported goods worth $3.38 trillion, while importing only $2.557 trillion, leaving an enormous gap that continues to grow. For comparison, the entire European Union managed a trade surplus of just $41 billion in the same period, a figure that is 95% smaller than China's massive surplus. And when those containers finally reach the shores of the United States, the imbalance becomes even more extreme. America remains the single largest consumer market on Earth. Year after year, the U.S. imports far more goods than it exports to the rest of the world. As a direct result, containers arrive bursting at the seams with products from overseas, but there simply aren't enough American-made goods flowing in the opposite direction to fill those same containers for the return voyage. Reliable industry data shows that only about 40% of containers departing from U.S. ports are actually loaded with cargo. So what happens to the remaining 60%, the empty ones? Most people assume they simply sail back empty, ready to be refilled in China. But that's not what really happens in practice. A huge number of these surplus empty containers end up sitting idle for months or years, eventually rusting away in sprawling junkyards scattered across America. Why on earth would that be? The economics are brutal and straightforward. Shipping a single empty container back across the Pacific to China costs shipping companies around $3,000 or more, depending on fuel prices and routes. On top of that steep fee, an empty container occupies precious deck space on a ship, space that could instead be used to carry a fully paid, revenue-generating load worth millions of dollars. From China's perspective, there's no real incentive to pay for a used second-hand container at that price. Chinese manufacturers can produce brand new, high-quality shipping containers for roughly $2,000 each, and every single year, the world sees production of about 2.5 million brand new containers. There is simply no shortage of supply, so those unwanted surplus containers accumulate in massive stacks at ports and storage yards across the United States and parts of Europe. Many of them are eventually sold off at bargain basement prices for alternative uses, temporary storage sheds on construction sites, emergency housing solutions, innovative pop-up shops, or even full-scale homes and office buildings constructed almost entirely from repurposed shipping containers. When they finally reach the end of their useful life in these secondary roles, they're broken down and melted for scrap steel, each standard container yielding roughly 2 tons of recoverable metal. The next time you drive past a port or an industrial area and see those towering stacks of rusty, weather-beaten containers, take a moment to really look at them. They're not merely abandoned junk. They stand as silent, powerful symbols of a deeply unequal and imbalanced global economy, one where the flow of goods is overwhelmingly one-directional. Now let's shift our focus to another puzzle that continues to baffle even seasoned industry experts and economists. If the United States is undeniably the world's top oil producer today, ahead of traditional powerhouses like Saudi Arabia and Russia, then why on earth can't America simply refine and use more of its own abundant domestic oil instead of relying so heavily on imports? The numbers don't lie. The U.S. leads global production rankings, yet it consistently ranks among the world's largest net importers of crude oil and petroleum products. It exports large volumes of its own light crude while simultaneously buying foreign heavy crude to feed its refineries. There are 3 primary interconnected reasons behind this counterintuitive situation. First and foremost, the chemistry of crude oil itself is not uniform. Not all crude oil is created equal. Most of the oil surging out of American shale fields today, thanks to the fracking revolution, is classified as light sweet crude. It has low density, low viscosity, and very low sulfur content, making it relatively easy and inexpensive to refine into high-value products like gasoline. However, a significant portion of America's existing refinery infrastructure was designed and built decades ago, long before the shale boom. Those facilities were optimized to process heavier, sour crude oils imported from places like Mexico, Venezuela, Canada, and the Middle East, heavier grades with higher sulfur and more complex refining requirements. Completely upgrading or retooling those massive refineries to handle light crude more efficiently would require investments exceeding $200 billion, an enormous sum that no company or government has been willing to commit to on that scale. Instead, the pragmatic business decision has been to export the valuable light crude at premium international prices while continuing to import cheaper heavy crude grades that match the existing refinery configurations. Second reason, pure logistics and geography create major bottlenecks. Oil production hubs and major refining centers are often separated by hundreds or thousands of miles with inadequate transportation links. For example, the prolific Permian Basin in Texas produces enormous volumes of oil every day, but the pipeline network connecting it efficiently to demand centers on the East Coast has historically been limited and constrained. California offers an even more extreme case. It has effectively become an oil island within its own country. Due to a combination of geography, environmental regulations, and underdeveloped pipeline infrastructure, California imports nearly 70% of the crude oil it refines from foreign sources rather than relying on domestic supplies from other states. Third, and this is perhaps the most controversial and debated factor, the infamous Jones Act of 1920. Enacted in the aftermath of World War I, when America struggled with wartime shipping shortages and dependence on foreign vessels, the Jones Act was intended as a national security measure. It mandates that any goods transported by sea between two U.S. ports must be carried on ships that are American-built, American-owned, American-flagged, and crewed entirely by American citizens or permanent residents. The original goal was noble: to maintain a strong domestic merchant marine fleet capable of supporting military logistics in times of conflict. But in today's globalized economy, the law has produced unintended consequences that many critics call an economic burden. Building and operating ocean-going ships in the United States is dramatically more expensive, often 3 times the cost, compared to shipyards in China, South Korea, or other major maritime nations. American crew wages, safety standards, and regulatory requirements drive operating costs even higher. As a direct result, transporting a barrel of oil from production fields in Texas to refineries or markets on the East Coast using a Jones Act compliant vessel can add roughly $5 or more per barrel in extra transportation costs. In many cases, it literally becomes cheaper for East Coast refineries to import oil from overseas sources than to ship it domestically from the Gulf Coast. A protective law designed to safeguard America's security interests has over time morphed into a significant economic drag on domestic energy flows. These 3 interlocking factors, chemistry mismatches, logistical hurdles, and the Jones Act's restrictions, explain the strange paradox of why the world's single largest oil producer continues to depend so heavily on foreign oil imports. Now, let's move away from America's domestic energy challenges and turn our attention to a completely different kind of high-stakes international intrigue: Iran's